Okay, so today we're going to finish up the language of anatomy. We're going to talk about cavities and membranes. So we talked about sectional planes last time, and remember when you do a dissection, what you do is you cut something basically in half, and you create a sectional plane on each side. Remember, it's a flat surface along which a cut was made. Well, if you do that, say the arm, so here's the arm or whatever, if you were to do a section across it, what it looks like is it's fairly solid. There's nothing really going on in there. You have muscles and you have nerves and you have bone and so on, but it's pretty solid. But if you do that across certain parts of the body, what you see is they're not solid. So if you do it on the head, you're going to wind up with a big hollow space in here. If you do it in the chest cavity, you're going to wind up with a big hollow space in there. And so these are called cavities. So what a cavity is an opening, and it can be sealed off from the outside or it could be open to the outside. And so there are two types of these cavities. The kind that do not open to the outside are called enclosed cavities. So the only way to get into an enclosed cavity is to penetrate the body wall. So you have to take a needle or you have to take a trocar or something. You have to penetrate the body wall to get into these cavities. But there are also cavities that do open to the outside. And so if you think about your nose or your mouth, those places, they're open to the outside. And so you can insert objects. You can put food in there. You can put liquid. But you can also put things like scopes or swabs or things like that. And so we're going to look at these two different types of cavities. And so if you look here, you can see one. So here, this cavity, this is where the stomach and the intestines and lungs and stuff like that are. There's no way to get in there unless you open up the body wall. So this is one of those enclosed cavities. Well, this is also an enclosed cavity right here. That's what we're looking at. But there are also cavities like this, which do have an opening to the outside. Look, there's an opening here. This right here is a cavity, but it has an opening. If you go all the way to here, it has an opening to the outside. And so those are not enclosed, those are exposed. Well, let's look at these enclosed cavities first. So here is a model showing these enclosed cavities. So look, in order to get into this model, we took the plate off the front, but if this were a human body, you'd have to cut it. You'd have to penetrate the body wall to get in here. And look, what you see are lungs in here. Here's the heart. Here's the liver. Here's the stomach. There's the gallbladder. And then we have the small intestine and the large intestine. You can't see it probably very well, but right here would where the bladder would be and all of that. We cannot get into there without opening the body wall. Maria, this is the language of anatomy, the second half of it. So let's look at these cavities. And like I said, first we're going to look at the enclosed cavities. Well, if you look at the enclosed cavities, you can see what they look like. They look like this. There's two of these. There's one which is on the spine side. And remember, for the word for toward the spine was dorsal. And so that's called the dorsal cavity. So this yellow one that you see is the dorsal cavity. And then this one on the other side is toward the belly. And remember, the word for toward the belly is ventral. And so that's what this is called. This is called the ventral cavity. So we have a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. Well, if we look at this dorsal cavity, you could also call it posterior, but hardly anybody ever does. Most people just use the word dorsal. But remember, in humans, these two words are interchangeable, so it would be correct. But this dorsal cavity is where the nervous system is. The nervous system. And so if you look at it, it's this whole big yellow cavity. Well, look at this. Obviously, this is different from this. They don't even look alike. And they have different organs in them. So we can subdivide this dorsal cavity into two smaller cavities. The cranial cavity, and that's where the brain is located. And then the vertebral or spinal cavity, which is where the spinal cord is. So we have cranial cavity and vertebral cavity. We also have this much bigger ventral cavity. So the ventral cavity could be called anterior, but again, nobody does. But it would not be wrong because those two words in humans are interchangeable. But this is this large, big cavity. In this picture, you can see it. It's this red color. And so it goes all the way from here, all the way down to here. It's a huge cavity. Well, when something is that big, it's easier to talk about if you can subdivide it. And so, fortunately, there is a muscle which divides it basically in half, and that muscle is called the diaphragm. So if we go back to this picture, you can see the diaphragm right here. This is the diaphragm. And it basically separates this into two parts. Everything above the diaphragm is called the thoracic cavity. Everything below the diaphragm is called the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominopelvic. So again, we can subdivide this into two parts. Thoracic, everything superior to the diaphragm. And then abdominopelvic, everything inferior to the diaphragm. But still, this is a huge cavity even after we subdivide it. And so it would be nice if we could subdivide it even more. Well, this thoracic cavity has some natural subdivisions in it. So there are smaller cavities in here. If you look in here, you can see these smaller cavities. There's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. Now look, they're not very big. They're really thin cavities like this. They're not very big, but they're in there. Well, there's a cavity that surrounds each lung. Those are called the pleural cavities. So these are the pleural cavities. There's one here and one here. They're not connected to each other. They're separate from each other. And then there's a cavity that surrounds the heart also. And that's called the pericardial cavity. So here's the pericardial cavity right here. And again, it's not very wide, not very big, but that's the pericardial cavity, and it surrounds the heart. Well, there's also something left over. And what's left over is this space right here. And that space is called the mediastinum. So we can subdivide this thoracic cavity into these smaller cavities. Two pleural cavities, a pericardial cavity, and the mediastinum. The same thing's true for the abdominopelvic cavity. Very large space. Look at it. It's all of this space right here. And so again, it's nice if we could subdivide it. Well, there isn't a muscle or a natural cavity in here, but we have sort of an artificial cavity that's created by the pelvis. So if you look at the pelvis looks sort of like this, and it's what the bones in the hip are attached to, and it joins right here in the middle, and it joins around in the back. And what it creates is something that's almost like a bowl. Well, the word for bowl is pelvis. So the pelvis is a bony bowl. And so look, if we're inside this bony bowl, which is in here, we're in the pelvic cavity. If you're not inside the bony bowl, but you're part of this abdominopelvic cavity, you're in the abdominal cavity. So just like these others, we're going to subdivide it. So we subdivide this abdominopelvic into the pelvic and the abdominal. If you look in the pelvic cavity, you're going to find the bladder, you're going to find reproductive organs, you're going to find the rectum. If you look in the abdominal cavity, you're going to find things like the stomach, the liver, the intestines, the gallbladder, the spleen, all of those organs. So those are our divisions. So this whole thing is the ventral cavity. It's subdivided into the thoracic and abdominopelvic. And then thoracic is subdivided into these, and abdominopelvic is subdivided into these. Any questions about any of that? Well, if you look at these cavities, remember they're hollow spaces. So here might be a hollow space with an organ in it. And we can pick any organ we want. Let's say it's the heart. So here's a hollow space with the organ inside it. Well, it isn't just a hollow space and then nothing. There's something lining the hollow space. And what lines the hollow space, right here on the edge of it, is a membrane. So a membrane is sort of like a flat sheet. And a good way to think of it is to think of like a sheet of cellophane. So if you ever use a cellophane in your kitchen or something like that, where you wrap something in plastic or whatever, you get these sheets, thin sheets, and they're clear. And so if you wrap them around something, you're going to see whatever it's wrapped around. That's what these membranes are like. They're called serous membranes. Sometimes the word is serosa. That means the same thing, serous membranes or serosa. We're going to find these in this ventral cavity. Well, if you look at a serous membrane, it's not one layer, it's two. It's a double layered membrane. So remember I said it's like taking a sheet of cellophane, but it's like taking two sheets of cellophane and then wrapping that around an organ, so maybe an apple or something. So it's not one layer, it's two layers. Well, if I do that, if I take this apple and I wrap it in a double layer of membrane, so here's one layer, and then there's another layer. It's a double layered membrane. Well, one layer is going to touch the apple. It's going to be right up next to it. And one of them is not going to touch. Well, we have names for both of those. Here's another way of thinking about it. Think about a balloon. A balloon you blew up with air and then you tied it off. And here's the little stem or whatever. You tied it off. And then you take your fist and you push it down into the balloon. Well, look, this balloon is clear. It's like that cellophane. It's clear, it's thin. Well, when I push my fist down in here, I create two layers. So look, there's one layer that's touching my fist. It's right here. And then there's one layer that does not touch the fist. It's right here. So now there are two layers, just as if I had two layers of cellophane or something. The layer touching the organ is called the visceral layer. Visceral means organ, so it's touching the organ. And the layer that does not touch the organ, this one out here, is called the parietal layer. So we've got two layers, a visceral and a parietal. So here's the same thing, but let's pretend it's not air in the balloon, it's water in the balloon. So there's water in there, right here. But still, we've got two layers. We've got a visceral layer that touches the organ. And we've got a parietal layer, which does not touch the organ. And then in between, we've got this place, this space, this cavity, where there, in this case, is water. That's exactly what it's like. But think about this. Is that fist actually inside the balloon? Is it? Is it inside the balloon? No. What's in the balloon? Air or water is in the balloon. But look, it's surrounded by the balloon. It's not inside it, but it is surrounded by it. So, not inside it, but it's surrounded by it. And when you push the fist down in there, you're going to create two layers. One layer touching the fist, one layer not touching the fist. And then we're going to have this space, this cavity in between. Well, the heart is exactly like that. The heart looks like someone just took the heart and shoved it into a balloon. And so look, when you shove it into the balloon, you create two layers. So here's one layer right here, which is touching the heart. But there's this other layer right here, which is not touching the heart. And there's a space in between. And that space has fluid in it, like water, like our water balloon. So what we're going to wind up with is a double layered membrane, a visceral layer and a parietal layer, and then we're going to wind up with a cavity or space with fluid in it. Well, around the heart, these membranes are called pericardia. So we have a visceral pericardium, a parietal pericardium, and a pericardial cavity or space, and it has this serous fluid in it. So it's very, very similar to our analogy with the balloon. Any questions about it? Does it make sense? So look, if I look at the heart, it's in this big cavity we talked about. That's the ventral cavity. And then it's in the smaller part above the diaphragm, the thoracic cavity. And then it's even in a smaller part here, the pericardial cavity. So it's in a cavity within a cavity within a cavity. The exact same thing is true for other organs here. So heart, pericardium. So we have visceral, parietal, and then the pericardial cavity with the fluid in it. But that's also true for the lungs. So lungs look just like this. So you can use the exact same analogy that you're pushing your fist down into the balloon, but now the lungs are pushed in here. And again, there's two layers. There's one layer that does not touch the lung, There's one layer that does touch the lung. And then there's this space in between that's full of fluid. So just like before, we're going to have a visceral, a parietal, and a cavity. But we can't call it pericardia because pericardia means heart. So around the lungs, it's called pleura. So we have a visceral pleura, a parietal pleura, and a pleural cavity. And inside that pleural cavity is serous fluid. So if we blow that up, there's the lung right there. And then there's the visceral layer, there's the parietal layer, and there's the cavity in between the two. The exact same thing is true down in the abdominopelvic cavity. So down here, same thing we're going to see. And it looks like this. If we do a transverse section, we see this big cavity in here with organs in it. But look, there's a membrane right here. And there's a membrane right here. So it's the same thing. It's just the cavity is a little bit bigger. But there is a visceral layer. That's this one. And there is a parietal layer. That's this one. And then there's the cavity right there. But we can't call it pericardia and we can't call it pleura. Down here it's called peritoneum. So we have a visceral peritoneum, a parietal peritoneum, and a peritoneal cavity. If we look at it in a different section, you can see it here. So here's the sagittal section. And if you look at it in the sagittal section, they painted these different colors for you. There is the parietal. And the blue one here is the visceral. And the yellow is this peritoneal cavity. Make sense to everyone? Any questions? So, if we just summarize all that, this is what we get. So here's a summary slide, so you can come back to this when you look at it. So we have the pericardium around the heart. We have the visceral and parietal layers. We have the pleura around the lungs. We have the visceral and parietal layers. We have the peritoneum around the abdominopelvic organs and a visceral and parietal layer. And then don't forget, there's a cavity between each of these layers, and it contains this serous fluid. So serous fluid is slicky. It's lubricating, so it reduces friction. It also provides nourishment to these layers. And the layers actually secrete the fluid. So here's another view of all those. So there, pericardium, there, pleura, there, peritoneum. Any questions? Again, pericardium, pleura, peritoneum. So those are the enclosed cavities. But remember, we also have exposed cavities. So exposed cavities open to the outside. And so these are cavities of the digestive system. They're cavities of the respiratory system. They're cavities of the reproductive system. And so if you look at them, remember, you can put a speculum in here. You can put your Q-tip in here. You can put your finger in here. These are all cavities that can be entered from the outside. And they don't just stop here, they go on down. So you can take an endoscope and go all the way down into the stomach. Or you can start at the other end and go all the way through the intestines. You can go here and go down into the lungs. They're open to the outside. And so if you look at these, you can see them here. So here is the nasal cavity. And then you go into the oral cavity, and there's the tracheal cavity and bronchi. Or you could go this way and go into the esophagus and go down into the stomach and on all the way through. So they're open. They're exposed. Well, they also have membranes. Remember, our other membranes were called serous membranes, and they had 2 layers. Well, these are called mucous membranes, and mucous membranes only have 1 layer. It's a thick layer, but they only have 1 layer. So look, there's the membrane right there of the nasal cavity. There's the membrane of the oral cavity. There's the membrane of the trachea and the membrane of the esophagus and the membrane of the stomach and so on. Well, because they are mucous membranes, they're also called mucosa. And then all we do is we put the name of the cavity in front of it. So we have the mucosa of the nasal cavity, or the nasal mucosa. We have the mucosa of the oral cavity, or the oral mucosa, esophageal mucosa, bronchial mucosa, gastric mucosa, all the way down. These are mucous membranes. And the reason they are called that is because they secrete mucus. And mucus, you can probably think of snot, something that comes out of your nose. That is mucus. It's sticky, it's wet. So these membranes are exactly like that. And it's also lubricating. And then finally we have one last membrane. And this one's different from all the other membranes because it's dry. This is the only dry membrane in the whole body. But it's the membrane that faces the outside. We mostly call it the skin, but the membrane is technically called the cutaneous membrane. So the cutaneous membrane is the only dry one. Okay, so those are cavities and membranes. Any questions about those? Well, we haven't quite finished talking about anatomical terms. We looked at these. Remember these anatomical terms? And if you look on the face, there's a bunch of them. Look how many anatomical names or anatomical terms there are. There's a bunch. And if you go down here, there's a bunch. And if you go down here, there's a bunch. But look how many there are between here and here. And I didn't draw it very well. Look how many there are between here and here. There's this. There's this. That's really about it. But look how big this space is. It's very large space for just such a few anatomical names, a few things we can see easily. And things that we can see easily, we call them landmarks, because we use them to figure out where we are. So if somebody came into the hospital with a lesion right here, if we were to try to describe where it is using the landmarks, it would be very difficult to do. So we need some other way of doing it. So we only have these few in this area. So look, try to describe the location of this lesion. Talk to yourself. Try to figure out how you would tell somebody else. They're not looking. They're not with you. They're on the phone or they're across the room or whatever. And this is a stab wound. Or I don't know, it's a pox pustule, or it's I don't know what it is, but it's a lesion of some kind, and you need to tell them exactly where it is. It's going to be difficult to do. So to make it easier, we artificially are going to divide this space up. And there's two ways to divide it up. We can use either quadrants or we can use regions. So let's look at these. Let's look at regions first. Regions looks like a tic-tac-toe. In other words, we're going to draw 2 lines this way and 2 lines this way across the abdominal pelvic area. And the way we're going to keep it in the right place is we're going to make sure the umbilicus is right in the very center. And it's going to look just like a tic-tac-toe board. So then when you do that, we're going to name each square. Well, remember, right there's where the umbilicus is, so we're going to call that the umbilical region. These other regions are also named for what's there. Remember, epi means on top of, and gastric means stomach. It's on top of the stomach. If you look here, hypo means beneath or below, and chondro means cartilage. And here's the lumbar sections of the back. Here's iliac, those means hips, and hypogastric below the stomach. And so when we do that, this is what we're going to see. So there are 9 regions. Remember how important right and left is. Do you remember how we determine right and left? How you know? Whose right is it? Yeah, and so here's our patient. This is him right here. And this is his right. So this whole side is the right. This is his left. So this whole side is the left. And if he turns around and we look at him from the other side, this is not going to change. We're still going to look at his right, his left. So here are the names of the regions. There's umbilical in the middle. And then here's the right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, right lumbar, right iliac, left iliac, and then the epigastric and hypogastric. And these regions work not only from the outside, they also work from the inside. So the same regions are here. And so you should quiz yourself. See if you can name what these regions are. And then if you want to know what organs are in each, most organs are in more than one region. So like if you look at the liver, look, it's this big. So it's 2 regions. The stomach, even though most of it's here, a little bit is over there. There are a few things that are only in one region. Like the bladder is only in one region. But most things are in more than one. If you stay in medicine, you're not going to use regions very much. They don't use this in medicine very much. It's used for anatomy. What they use in medicine, though, are quadrants. And quadrants are easier. So instead of having 4 lines, we've only got 2, and the umbilicus goes right in the middle. So if you look at this, there's the umbilicus. So we're going to draw a vertical line and a horizontal line right through it. And what you're going to wind up with are 4 quadrants. So look, again, here's our patient. And this is his right, and this is his left. So we have a right on each side and a left on each side. We have an upper on each side and a lower on each side. So we wind up with 4 quadrants. The right upper, right lower, and left lower. So Priscilla says, "Sir, are you a doctor?" It's okay to ask me that. I am not a medical doctor. I'm a PhD. So you can still call me doctor, but I'm not the kind that treats patients. I have a PhD in physiology. I've taught doctors, but I'm not one. But anyway, here we go. So there's the umbilicus right there where the cross is. And so now, though, you can see that a lot of organs are pretty much confined to a single quadrant. Now, some of them still branch over to the others. But say this, if you have a patient that presents with right lower quadrant tenderness, then you might suspect that they might have appendicitis or something like that. People are often have problems with their gallbladder, and this is where they feel pain and rebound tenderness right here. So if we were going to do regions, we would draw 4 lines. So remember, our umbilicus is going to be right along here. So we want that to be in the center of our line. So here's our 4 lines right here. And you should be able, again, to name those regions. And then if we're going to do quadrants, again, right here somewhere is our umbilicus. And so we're going to draw a vertical line through that and a horizontal line through that and wind up with 4 quadrants. Any questions? So that is the end of our first PowerPoint for lab. And so we'll have another quiz this afternoon sometime. It'll show up, usually they show up right around 3:30 or 4 over the stuff we covered today. So that would be cavities and membranes, that would be quadrants, that would be regions, that sort of thing. So Priscilla asks, do we have 1 attempt for lab quizzes? All quizzes except for that very first one. The syllabus quiz, even though you get a grade, it really isn't for a grade. And so it's for so that you understand how the class works. And that's why I let you take it as many times as you need to, as multiple times. So you can take that one over and over and over until you get 100, actually get 100.5. But all the other quizzes are just 1 attempt. But you should definitely mess with this until you get 100. So Anisha says, when are the quizzes due? There's only 1 due date in this whole class, and that's the last day of class. So all the quizzes are due then, all the tests, everything's due on the last day. That does not mean that you should wait till the last day, because we're going to have a bunch of quizzes, and then you have 3 lecture exams, 3 lab exams, and a case study. There is no way, if you procrastinate, you're going to get really, really far behind. So Maria says, is there a discussion board for this class? I have not set up a discussion board. Would you like one? I don't know if other people would join you, but you don't have to do it. Are going to have, though, collaborate for Q&A. So if you look at the the calendar, every so often there's a Q&A collaborate where you come in and bring in your questions. So Johanan says number of quiz are based. I don't understand that question, Johanan. And how many quizzes are we going to have? Is that what you're asking? Well, I'll tell you the truth. I don't know exactly how many quizzes we're going to have. There's going to be basically a lab quiz every single day. Almost, it's like a daily quiz. But there are also lecture quizzes, and typically there's one, sometimes two lecture quizzes per topic. So, like when we finish a topic, we'll have a quiz. Sometimes the topic is a long topic, and sometimes there's two. Maria says, if you could, that would be great. If not, it's okay. I can certainly set it up, but I don't know if anybody's going to show up.